Hey guys, this is Justin Ross, and you're listening to The Hook Rocks with Jay Scott right here in Chicago.
Hey everybody, what's going on? It is Jay Scott. This is another episode of the Hook Rocks, the Ultimate Rock Community Podcast. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're staying safe, staying healthy, staying strong. Spring is in full swing. It's been here for a week now, and weather's getting better. Things are getting better. I hope they continue to do so, although we've starting to see some numbers kind of spike again. Hopefully that's just a temporary thing as people get vaccinated across the country, and hopefully as the weather continues to warm up, venues, concert halls, wherever you spend your time are able to open up and we can start seeing some live shows again. So let's keep our fingers crossed. Let's hope it continues to be positive and we don't fall backwards, which is kind of the fear right now amongst a lot of people. But time will tell, right? But we're always here for you. We're offering escape for you, music commentary, music interviews, talking music here. 2021 is shaping up to be an incredible year for new music. But today we're going to talk about an album that is from the past, and maybe an album that not a lot of people know about. But this album is a celebration of what was back in the early 80s in Seattle, where everyone is familiar with the grunge scene that came along later in the early to mid-90s. Of course, we know about Heart, we know about Queensryche, we know about Jimi Hendrix, but there was a punk movement in Seattle during the early 80s as down south in California was getting into the glam and the Sunset Strip. There was something else going on here in Seattle, and that was kind of like the precursor to the grunge movement. And we have John Conte on the Hook Rocks podcast as a guest today, former member of the band The Living. The Living is known mostly for Duff McKagan's first band before he came to L.A. to join Guns N' Roses. We'd like to welcome in John. What's going on, man? How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you, Jay?
I'm doing well, man. Thank you for doing this. This is a really interesting, I don't want to say concept, but an interesting look back at an album that was very influential in a moment that was very influential to a scene that came about a decade later. And I'm really interested to kind of get to know you and kind of get to know what this album was about and what it led to.
Cool.
So
let's start.
Yeah, so we always start the same way, and that is the essence of the show. Just like every rock fan, music fan knows a song, every rock song has a hook that sucks you in. Every rock fan has that moment. Every music fan has that moment that whether it's a band, a performance, an album, or a song that hooked them on music. What was it for you?
Probably Mott the Hoople is where I would say I got hooked, and I had always my family has always been from my dad's side. There have always been musicians and singers that go all the way back to Italy. So all I know is that I was just sort of following my DNA. If I was to say which song is my favorite of the seven, I would have to say all of them because we were just really tight right then. Greg has been with us probably since December of '81, and we're getting to do what we really like to do with him, which is rehearse. An interesting thing about our rehearsals, when we started rehearsing, we're rehearsing at Todd, the bass player's home in the basement, and Mr. McCready is always hanging out with us at our rehearsals. Just this nice kid, you know. I don't know who he was and who he is. He was a friend of Todd. He's just hanging out with us all the time.
You know, it's interesting when you kind of revisit all that, and you revisit, you know, what was it like when you were younger, and you remember all these things and all these moments. And, you know, you mentioned Mott the Hoople, which was an early influence for you. And as, you know, as you moved forward and you started to go through, you know, the bands or approach the age where you were in the bands that you were at, even before the Living, what were some of the influences that went from, you know, Mott the Hoople to punk, which then inspired you to be in these punk bands?
Well, I think the thing is that I started out in cover bands, and you start, some of the times in the cover bands, you start learning really good standards. And those happen to be usually sort of the standards that are heavy into rhythm and blues. They can, I mean, it's similar to like a Stone song, but maybe even further back. Maybe not a Stone song, but just really good standards. And when you're learning all these standards, you start to learn those hooks. Well, the really cool thing is that once you start getting out of doing covers and you get introduced to other people and you see them writing their own material, you start to think, well, geez, I've got a good musical ear. Maybe I can do it too. And so that starts to occur to you as a musician. And then I think the simplest and the most fun form of getting an original out there and playing was to be in these power pop punk rock bands, because you didn't have a lot of money. So you really only got your instrument and the amp. You're not doing lots of effects. This means that you've got to write a pretty good, decent song, which means it's probably going to be short, because you're not going to over glamorize it. And for me, because I'm a vocalist, you're putting little hooks in there vocally to make it interesting and to make it, you know, hum along, and for people to actually, you know, figure out the melody of the song, and for them to hum it back to you. You know, that's when you know you've connected, and that's when you know you've written something that, yeah, it's communicating, it's working. And that's what was cool about being in a punk rock band, is because the songs are really tight, they're short, to the point, and at the same time you're trying to have fun. So it's a little bit of all that combination, and you're just working with what you've got.
It's also the energy, and it's also the attitude of the anti-establishment. And where did that come from in Seattle? I mean, where did the punk scene kind of evolve, and where did it start, and where did it go?
Well, I think a lot of kids would take out a lot of negativity and energy on the police of Seattle. They weren't exactly the best police force. Before I was in the Living, in two other bands, we would get into our vehicles and go to our rehearsal, but we were always getting pulled over by the same police officers all the time, even when we're not creating trouble, right? and we're not speeding, but they knew our vehicles, they knew our license plate numbers, and they would pull us over and take our pot and take our beer, and then we'd be on our way. And they're doing that consistently. And so then when you start hanging out with the punk rock scene, you start noticing that police just show up and beat somebody out of the blue. They'll just pick somebody up and just start beating them. Now, maybe that person has been doing some trouble, but you don't know that. And they just grab a person. I remember them coming into, our crowds where we'd be hanging out in the street, and they just grab somebody, So there's that. And then there's just the straight on angst of, you're young and you're a kid and you're going up against your family, maybe, or, a relative or your job. There was just lots of, and I think a lot of it's sort of put on though, where they're making it up. Kids would do that too, where they just wanted to create some trouble. Maybe just for the sheer fun of it.
Where does that, you mentioned the angst and you mentioned the youth, the anger towards the establishment, the anger towards authority, or the attitude towards authority. How does that seep into the music? Like, how does that, because I can't think of, rock and roll is based on an attitude, and heavy metal is based on an attitude. Punk is like 90% attitude, right? It's all that. You can see it in the faces when you're playing. You can hear it in the chords. You can hear it in the beat. You can just feel it. Why do you think, or how do you think that gets into the music?
That's a good question. I know that when I would, jam with musicians and we're trying to create a song, it's the tension from the bass and if it's a really strong beat, you're working off of that, and you're using that to create a feeling. And then once you can feel that, you start to see words in your head. And then with the words, you start to, focus on an image. Sometimes I know that some of the punk rock groups, some of the writers would be able to come up with maybe just a line, a written lyrical line, and work off that. Sometimes they would work off that with, just with the people they were hanging out with, and just, talk it off the wall to them. And then they would start to hear it, and you start to repeat things. You start to hear rhythms, and you start to hear the tension, especially if you're using tense words, and you just build off of it. I think it has a lot to do with people's feelings, people's attitudes, but it also, and the strange thing is now you find out that it's also how we take care of ourselves. So a lot of the, the punk rock kids that we were all hanging out with, some of them weren't taking very good care of themselves, meaning they weren't getting enough sleep, or they were, I can remember nights where none of us were, at a home. We'd just lie down on someone's lawn and sleep there for the night. It would be summertime, of course, if we were doing that. But, you're just sort of, you're trying to, I think if you're a punk rocker, you're trying to break free from society, and you're trying to hopefully you would think that you're thinking about trying to form a new one or betterment your society or your community, but punk rockers tend to they just want to rebel, and then they want to have some fun with it, so they sort of forget, if there's a purpose.
Well, yeah, I mean, because you really, get involved in that counterculture, and it's the environment that you're in, right? I mean, you mentioned, once you start playing punk rock music, you're hanging around with other punk rockers, and they're being harassed by authority, and that's a daily occurrence. It's happening all the time, and just like this past year with COVID-19 and the pandemic, and artists that are writing music under a element that they've never had before. They've never had, they've never been told they need to stay indoors. They've never been told they need to be 6 feet apart, and they can't go certain places, and certain places are shut down. And, whether it was the pandemic, you had a very toxic election process, you had the protests in the summer, all that's going on, and that affects you. No matter if you think about it or not, it affects how you write. It affects the tone of the music that you are playing, and whether you realize it or not, it's coming out of you what you are taking in.
Very much so. Yeah, I totally agree.
How did
Go ahead.
How did the Living start? What's the origins of the Living?
There had been a band before that called The Missing Link, of which Chris Sutting is playing drums in that band. And then he had another band, which was called The Veins, where he's playing guitar. I'm in The Missing Link as the vocalist. The Missing Link was more power pop than punk rock, but the scene that we were playing in is again the punk rock scene, because that's the venues there, and that's our audience. Chris ends up quitting both bands, but he tells me that we've gotten kicked out of the Missing Link. I didn't know that he had quit both bands until just a few years ago. So he sort of fibbed to me about the fact that we got kicked out of the Missing Link. That's like 1978 1979. So I decide that I'd go back to school. So I end up going back. I'd taken a year off from school and didn't go to college right away. So then I decided to go to college, and that's how I end up down in Eugene. And of course, the minute I get down there, I just glance through the newspaper to see if there's anybody looking for a vocalist. And sure enough, there's a band, and I call them. They were called the Pedestrians. I don't end up singing for them because they've got 4 or 5 people in the band that are singing. They just don't know what they're doing with their vocals. So I help them out and become sort of their roadie and promoter, and just big all-time fan of theirs, and so I hang out with them all the time, and I just totally get the bug again to want to play. And I kept in touch with Chris, and I'm calling him from time to time, and he tells me that he's been talking to Duff, and he thinks I should move home. So I moved back home, and the 3 of us form the beginning of the band. So the beginning of the band, it's sort of unique what Chris wants to do. He wants Duff and him to trade off on guitar and drums. So in a sense, you get you're getting 2 different bands in one band, which is pretty odd because you're getting 2 different sets. We would normally start off with Duff on drums, so Chris is on guitar, and then we would finish with Chris on drums and Duff on guitar. And that's ironic that's how we would do the gigs then too when we started. And there's some irony there, because we obviously already recognize that Duff is not the better guitar player, but the sound of the band and what we're doing, and just him being up front, it's just more dynamic. It excites the crowd more. It's his numbers when he's up there, where Chris's numbers when Chris is the guitar player. The problem is that we get late into the fall of 81, and Chris is in multiple bands again. He's playing in multiple bands because he's a multi-instrument, and he's a bit of an egotist, Chris. He wants more of the limelight on him and less on the rest of the group. And, when you're in a group, it's teamwork. It's a group. It's not, not one person is the star. It's all four of you are trying to be the stars. So the problem with Chris then is that he doesn't want to meet our rehearsal schedule. And we've got it up to, at least we want to be rehearsing no less than 3 days a week. But even though Todd and Duff would rather, we could, rehearse even more. If we could get up to 5, that would be even better. So Chris doesn't want to meet our rehearsal schedule, and he thinks that we're good enough that we just don't need it. Well, that discourages Todd and Duff, and I'm the eldest of all of us, because I'm 20 then, in 81, and I just said, well, then we're going to let him go. And so we did, and we managed to find Greg by the end of December 81, and we get into, and we're rehearsing almost 6 days a week, and the guys would rather go 7. So we banged it up massively once we get Greg on board. But the dynamic changes with having Duff now be straight on guitar the whole time. It changes the band. It makes us even stronger. It puts more responsibility on Duff. So his songwriting, it's improving. He's cranking out more numbers. I do write. I do have numbers. We just never recorded them. And we do play them in our set. So it's not like my numbers tend to be more melodic and tend to be more power pop and more, little bit more rock. And they're still very raw and have that raw edge to them or sound. It's just that that's me. I'm just a little bit more melodic. But, we go on through with Greg, and we get to April, and one of the reasons why we end up in the studio is because we're being blacklisted by a booking agent in Seattle. Every time we're able to get a gig, whether it's at an all-ages venue or a bar, a club, we get canceled the next day. Somehow this guy is going in there and he's booting us off the bill. He had that much power. This guy is trouble. He wanted to be our manager, but we have a promoter who we call our band manager, but we don't necessarily like this guy because we just recognize that there's something wrong about him, that he doesn't pass the smell test. 2 years after I'm booted out of the band, the FBI starts calling me at my parents' home because I'm still living there at the time. They want information about this bookie, about this guy. And I do have information about this guy. At that time, I'm a roadie for a band because it was a great way to get into shows, great way to be with a fun band, and get free beer.
That's important.
And so I'm doing, that. But the guitar player in that band, he's giving me the manager's phone numbers, and it's this guy. He's giving me the numbers because this guy is changing his numbers constantly, and he wants me to have him. He tells me, you've got to have these phone numbers if you need to get in touch with us or you need to find us. Well, that's sort of odd. Don't I have his phone number? Which I do. So I'm not quite sure what this is all about. It took me a long time afterwards to figure out, to work backwards. How is it that the FBI is calling? How did they know how to find me? So the guitar player, I had met his brother. His brother was in the pedestrians. Their father is either the chief of police or he's a high-level detective down in Eugene, Oregon. And obviously there's something bad about this guy if I'm being given these phone numbers. And what it turns out is that he's the cocaine dealer in the city, one of the big ones. And what he was doing, which I just now think is just so ugly. He's one of those guys. He's putting all these shows together, but he's also right there at the door taking the tickets at the shows. So if you were in the know, you knew that he had cocaine. So he's selling tickets to these shows and he's selling cocaine at the door somehow, or, working out. But he's the cocaine dealer. And how I find out is at the end of all the phone calls, the FBI tells me what has been going on and why they needed me to cooperate. And how I know it was the FBI are two things. My father took the first phone call, and my father is a lawyer. And my father was on the phone call with the FBI for a good few minutes, a very good few minutes. And then all of a sudden I can hear my dad saying, "Oh, wait, I'm not John Conte you want to be talking to. It's my son." And of course, as Dad gives me the phone, he's telling me, you tell them what they want and you're going to be okay. Now, the other thing, how I also can verify that this was really the FBI was when James Comey describes in his testimony how the FBI works. And he talks about this method that's 30, 35 years old, where they don't go to your door, where they don't meet with you, face to face. They call you on the phone, and he says it's always two agents, and they introduce themselves, and there's always two agents on the phone. And that's exactly what happened. When I'm listening to his testimony, and he described how they go about their interviews over the phone, I was shocked. The hair is, shaped.
Yeah, I've never experienced that, but I have a friend who ended up going away for a while for dealing drugs. And I was talking to him after he was let out, and he told me that prior to him getting arrested, the FBI called him, and there were two agents on the line, and they basically said, we know what you're doing, you should stop. And they had like a 15, 20-minute conversation with him, and then 2 days later, he was arrested.
Wow. Well, okay, so when they're on the phone with me, I don't know what they have on me.
Right.
And not only do I not know what they have on me, I'm trying to figure it out, but I never asked them.
When you think back of this album and you look now that you're revisiting it, what was the decision to re-release this? How did that decision come about?
So a very small record company down in Portland, Oregon. And when I mean record company, so this guy, he's got a record store where he's collecting punk rock records, and he's doing trades and sales, and he goes around the country trying to find old things, you know, in quantity so that he can sell them. And he also tends to find stuff that's out of print and then, you know, goes and reprints it, or he finds a band where they have material like we did, and he puts it out on his own label. And that's what happened. And this guy, the funny thing about him was he had been up here in Seattle, and he had heard it in a record store because one of the, you know, people behind the counter had a copy of it on tape and was playing it, you know, in the store. And of course, you know, the owner of this record store company hears it, he likes it, goes up to the, you know, cash register guy and asks what the heck this is, and finds out all about us, finds the old promoter, able to connect with him, and hears the whole thing, and then takes a whole year. Nobody can find me. It takes him a year. He finds my father in the fall of 2008, and then I sit on the phone message for 3 months and don't call him back until January 2009. He gives us an offer. We all decided, okay, we'll do it. But then it goes into the fact that this guy just keeps dragging his feet, and the method of how he does his releases is the release before us has to finish selling, and then he takes that money and uses that money for the next release. So you find out he really doesn't have enough money to do it, and the dragging of the feet it never happened. So by 2013, that sort of falls apart. Greg has had the master all this time. He's constantly working on it from time to time. And every time he works on it, I know if we get to talk to him, my guess is he keeps improving the sound quality of it every time he gets to work on it throughout these years from 2009 till now. We do get another offer from another record company doing the same type of thing down in Portland, Oregon. Another store that has their own label. Now it's 2017. My spouse, Barb, she died December 2016. And it's now the fall of 2017. And I need a lift. So, and I had somehow I get the email address to the owner of this record company, and I flat out just said to him, release the record now, it'll sell. And just do it now. Don't drag your feet. If he wants to wait all the way until the next year for record day, which is April, and that year was going to be 4/20 that year, but I don't want to wait until April, and I don't want to wait any longer, and I tell him that. And somehow in that email, he just decides that we're not worth it, and so he cancels the record. There had been a red flag from this record company, and it was when we're negotiating the cover of the album, and the cover of the album is the one you see. That is what we wanted. That is a photo of Todd, our bass player. I was standing next to the photographer when that happens. I know what gig that is. That is a gig down in Pioneer Square. The guitar player for the Presidents of the United States of America is in the audience that night. We are opening for the Fastbacks that night. It is one of our most phenomenal shows, and also historical. The guitar player for the Presidents of the United States of America does a review of that show, but he does a review of that show years later for Parade magazine in the Seattle Times. And it's fabulous. He calls it the best rock and roll gig he had ever been to in his life. And he describes it so accurately. The one thing he forgets is that my father, the next morning, points out to me that in the newspaper, we started a white riot that starts from that place that we played at in Pioneer Square, and the white riot moved all the way across the city and finishes in the U District.
But when you're revisiting this album, right, and you're revisiting the music, and gosh, that was 30 some years ago, 40 some years ago, and you're listening to yourself, and you're listening to the music, and you're in a different headspace now as well. Your life has evolved and moved on. What was it like revisiting this stuff, though?
Well, it hasn't changed, and I can hear why people like it. I can hear it, and I mean, when we finished that, and that was essentially what we thought was going to be a demo tape. We each got 2 master cassettes. Well, Duff takes one of his master cassettes and gives it to Kurt Bloch, and Kurt Bloch had a cassette dubbing machine, but he wasn't the only one who had a dubbing machine. That cassette gets dubbed so massively that throughout the summer and the rest of the spring and summer of 1982, we're driving around in the University District, in the Roosevelt District, in the Laurelhurst District, and we can hear that song being played in people's cars, people's apartments, being played out of people's homes, and we don't know who those people are. But that's how, the tape just got dubbed and dubbed and dubbed and passed on and passed on. And so when I hear it now and I'm getting all this praise, and I read all these articles that have been written, and it's a lot similar. The effect that's going on now is what was happening then. And darn if that isn't exciting, because, people are liking it all the way across the country. Right then, it was just little old tiny Seattle, Washington. So now it's multiplied, and holy moly. Yikes. I can understand why people like it. It doesn't sound bad. I can't find much. I know what's bad in it. I had just finished a cold, and I'm in my allergy season. So my vocals, in my opinion, I'm only in the 89 percentile. I'm not up. I don't feel like I'm up in my 90 percentile right now.
That's funny. When you think about what came after this era in Seattle music, and you think of when you think of the bands that were part of the grunge movement that were kind of spawned from this era of punk in Seattle, do you feel like you were a part of something, or that you influenced these bands that came after you guys?
Most definitely, but it's just never been noted. I think that my vocals definitely affected other singers, and they thought about it, and I think that's why you get such great singing from so many different bands, and why you hear baritone tenors and great tenors, and they're really singing. Really singing. And here's why. So I really did take my part very seriously. I was going to the best vocal coach in Seattle, Washington. His name was George Peckham. He's long since passed away. But George Peckham's, so his clients were the Manhattan Transfer, Hart, and Robert Plant whenever he would come into town. So I was in really good hands with George Peckham as far as I'm concerned. And I was working my butt off to be able to pay for that because my parents weren't paying for it. My dad helped me find him and got me the audition, but I was paying for every week when I was going to see George to work with him for 30 minutes. I was paying for it. And so I was a singer who really wanted to sing, even though it's punk rock. So, and I think it affected quite a lot of vocal quality. I think people start to take it a little more seriously. We've already got great musicians playing their instruments really well. It's just that, vocals are important. And then if you make your band a team, you're going to do really well.
When you talk, I mean, the members of the Living went on, of course, as being Guns N' Roses and Mother Love Bone. You had members from other bands. You mentioned Mike McCready, hanging out and listening to your rehearsals, early on. Was there, a sense when Duff left and, others were coming and going and people were hanging around that this was something that is propelling these other musicians and these bands to be what they were?
I definitely think that is going on, but I think a lot of the kids kept it to themselves. They never, I know I influenced numbers of kids in my own neighborhood because they went from being just regular kids to all of a sudden growing their hair out and they're playing instruments and then they're in a band. And it was all because, John Conte's in a band. Hey, I can do that too. I mean, so a lot of us had that. I didn't have that. I had nobody to look up to in terms of somebody that I knew, but there were kids after me that I know that I was influencing. And so I do think that we were, all of us were influencing a lot of people who come after us. And, you can see the family tree, but you don't know exactly that, where the line actually was drawn. But I do think a lot of us did have influence, and I do think what was going on is what does make the grunge scene happen.
Well, I mean, one of the members, Greg Gilmore, went on to Mother Love Bone, and Mother Love Bone was another catalyst to the grunge movement too, as well.
Yeah, and that's and of course that's what's so great about what's happened to us is that his experience with Stone and McCready is sort of why, in a sense, it's possible that's why Duff isn't acknowledging it and is sort of hiding it, because actually it shows that Duff is connected to Pearl Jam when he's in another band and they're not exactly, those two sounds don't exactly sound the same, and so it's hard for, how does Duff work out his history? His history doesn't work out unless we're in the picture, and it explains it. It explains him more. And I also think that because I do know, and I can tell you that Geffen Records called the house twice. Their A&R people called me, and that's while he's doing 10-minute warning. And they asked twice, can you get the band back together? And I said, I don't know. And the phone goes click. I thought it would, they knew I had the master. They knew I had the master. I told them. But they're more interested in the fact that they wanted the band back together. So I'm going to say that I think Duff's history in Guns is overlooked. He's underwritten, and he's possibly actually the person that they're forming the band around. That he's that important. I'm also going to say, I don't know for a fact because I didn't follow Guns N' Roses, but I've always been under the impression that they're not a real band. That they were put together by the record company. That they weren't really finding each other and gigging, working together like the way we had all put ourselves together. I think that's what the story is about them. And that's all about money, you see. Whereas, punk rock isn't necessarily always about money, though Duff does write a song where he does want money. That song, I Want, is also about the fact that he can't get a job. During the living, I'm working in 5 different jobs. The rest of the band has no jobs, and I'm paying for everything, which puts a lot of stress and responsibility on me. And Duff's trying to get a job, but he's not even telling us how bummed out he's getting because he's constantly getting rejected. So our era, also during our era, Elton John had come to town and he was going to record what becomes Caribou, which he doesn't record in Seattle, but he had come to town and they had written in the newspaper during that time that he was going to, he was going to help develop the Seattle sound and, get Seattle on the map. And of course he doesn't do that album in Seattle, but a lot of us, other than Heart, we can see that there's something there. There's something here in the town. There is a sound, there is a spirit, there is a movement, and we sort of know that it could pop. You just don't know when it's going to pop. Yeah. So it popped after us. But I think, in a sense, we had to come first for them to pop. Had we not been there, all of the bands of our era, then I don't think Cobain and Pearl Jam and all the rest of the good bands of that time from Seattle would have ever, I don't think they would have gotten the notoriety. I don't think they would have gotten there had to be a stepping stone, and we were the stepping stone.
It's an interesting history, John. It really is, and it's something that is overlooked a lot by music historians and people that want to talk about the movement in the 90s and in the grunge scene. But yeah, I love the record. I love the re-release. I just enjoy it immensely, and I want to thank you for coming on the show.
Honor. I'm totally I'm so overwhelmed with just so much gratitude. So thankful to everyone who's making this happen, and I'm hoping to, if all 4 of us are ever together, you should probably interview all 4 of us because it'll be a very funny time.
I can imagine. Absolutely. Well, John, it's been a blast. Thank you very much for doing the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, everybody. That's John Conte from the band The Living, the punk band The Living. I'm Jay Scott. This is The Hook Rocks, the Ultimate Rock Community Podcast. Stay strong, stay safe, stay healthy, and we will talk again soon. Thank you.